The Michigan Wolverines hit the road for the first time in 1997 for a homecoming date in Bloomington with the Indiana Hoosiers. It is also the first game in Big Ten play for the Maize and Blue. Welcome to Episode 5 of Road to the Victors, the story of the 1997 Michigan Wolverines. I'm your host, Andrew Hammond, Assistant Sports Editor at the Detroit Free Press. On this journey, we will take you game by game, week by week, to give you the inside look at how the 1997 Michigan Wolverines captured their share of a national title. The Michigan Wolverines carried an undefeated record and top 10 ranking into Bloomington, Indiana to face the Hoosiers. Indiana enters the game losers in 3 of their last 4 games to start the season, including a 27-26 loss to Wisconsin in the conference opener. Indiana is coached by Cam Cameron, a former Michigan assistant who is now at his alma mater. Now, he is looking to write a new chapter in the underwhelming story of Indiana football. Speaking of stories, if you want the complete story of the 1997 Michigan Wolverines, the Free Press is publishing a commemorative book. Hail Yes, the story of the 1997 Michigan Wolverines can be purchased at um.pictorial.mybook.com. As Michigan begins conference play, the Wolverines' biggest tests lie ahead. They begin the most difficult part of the season with 5 conference foes ranked in the top 25, although Indiana is not one of those teams. Big Ten play is a week old at this point, but this week is where the entire league begins their run for the Roses and the famed Rose Bowl at season's end in Pasadena, California. The big game this week is Ohio State hosting Iowa. The two teams will play a critical part in the Wolverine season down the road. When we come back, I am joined by Gene Myers, former sports editor at the Free Press, to break down Indiana and Michigan. This is Road to the Victors, the story of the 1997 Michigan Wolverines. Welcome back to Road to the Victors, the story of the 1997 Michigan Wolverines. I'm your host, Andrew Hammond, and this week I am joined by Gene Myers, former sports editor at the Free Press. Gene, there's really no other way to put this, but Indiana's football history isn't great. Frankly, it's awful. Following the glory days of the mid to late 1960s, this program has struggled. But in your estimation, why is this job and this program such a difficult task in terms of making it a consistent contender in the Big Ten?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons for that. One of them is, in some ways, if you're in a position like Indiana, you have to have the will to want to be a winner. And, Indiana more than proved it in basketball that they could be a power, and they had a tradition, and that was an emphasis. In football, they had a lot of things. They had and still have a lot of things going against them. One, Indiana is in a state with a giant population. So you don't have just, unlimited talent to pick from. And you have 3 major universities there: Indiana, Purdue in the same league, and Notre Dame, a behemoth. Now, Notre Dame can recruit all over the country and does, but if there's a really good player in Indiana, Notre Dame has the inside line for it. And there's it's really hard for a state that size to have 3 major schools. Now, Michigan, I think in some ways it's hard just having 2 major schools. But Indiana, it's just harder, and there wasn't the big, long tradition of greatness. And, and then you think, if you can't recruit a lot of great Indiana players, and there aren't, we go nearby. Well, where do you go nearby? Ohio, maybe. Well, Ohio State gets great players. Michigan and Michigan State all rate Ohio too. Where else do you go? Well, Illinois. Well, a lot of places go rate good players in Illinois, and Illinois doesn't do a great job of keeping them. And right near in Illinois, you've got 2 Big Ten teams too. So it's just, you don't have a giant, fertile, natural recruiting ground. And then without the tradition, you go try to get your speed kids out of like Florida or New Jersey or Texas. And if they're really good, Indiana isn't their first choice. So in some ways you have to work harder. You have to be better. And that's hard to do. That's really hard to do, especially consistently.
Following the first real scare of the season against Notre Dame, Michigan gets right on track, and frankly, they make this a laugher. This game isn't close at all. Michigan puts up 31 first-half points and makes homecoming a somber affair for the Indiana Hoosiers. It's the running game, but it's also the passing game that gets it done in the first half. He came up big last week, but we can make him a focus for the first time this series, it feels like. Michigan wide receiver Ty Streets really starts to come into his own. He would go on to have a solid run as a pro, but in a way, he feels like the first in a revival for great Michigan receivers. You have David Terrell, you've got Braylon Edwards, all these other guys that come along, but Ty Streets feels like he's the first of many that came along. Is that what you felt?
Ty's interesting because before the 97 season, it was the end of the previous year. He actually was on the basketball team for a while, and Michigan won the NIT. And during this championship season in football, he would reflect on that at times, saying, that was so exciting when we won a championship. Well, it was the NIT, and he was just like an extra player, but he was on the team and he played in like 13 games after the football season. And he had a taste of just what it was like to be a winner at Michigan. And I think he was a really, really talented receiver that didn't get the ball a whole lot, partly because Michigan was such a run-oriented team, partly because they had such a great offensive line and they could run. And that was the DNA of Bo Schembechler, Gary Moeller, Lloyd Carr. And in a lot of ways, you can't really argue with that. They had a lot of success that way. And during the 4 loss seasons, the 4 straight 4-loss seasons, at times Michigan wasn't great at running the ball. And when they didn't run it, they didn't necessarily win. And Street, if he were around today, he would have had way more catches, way more touchdowns. And everyone would say, like, wow, he was quite a player. And he was quite a player, but he didn't get that many chances then. And when he did, he tended to score or make big plays. And at this point in the season, he started to do that, partly because against like Notre Dame, they needed him to. And against Indiana, it's like, well, they didn't know they were going to destroy him. They figured they would. But it was like, I think the Notre Dame game taught Michigan, we may have to pass at some point this season. And they did, and they did well. And they stopped after half because they didn't need to do it anymore. The odd part for Streets was that before long, he actually got injured, where he actually suffered a dislocated thumb and a dislocated finger. But he was able to keep playing, but he had trouble catching the ball, as you might imagine, with bad hands. And fans got down on him in the middle part of the season because he was having some drops. And when he got healthy, it was for the Rose Bowl, where he had a spectacular game with 2 long touchdown catches. And he just really showed what he was capable of. And if he hadn't had that injury, who knows what he might have done the rest of the way during the season. But he was definitely a really good player. He showed it at times. And after he left Michigan, he lasted 6 years in the pros. And you don't last 6 years as a wide receiver if you're not good.
When we come back, we will talk about the Michigan defense as they look to pitch their first shutout of 1997, when Road to the Victors returns after this break. Welcome back to Road to the Victors, the story of the 1997 Michigan Wolverines. Michigan leads Indiana 31-0 at halftime, and the defense is looking to pitch a shutout for the first time all season. The biggest question is, can they do it? In the second half, Michigan would continue to make life difficult for the home team Indiana Hoosiers. To me, the stat of the game isn't the shutout that they would get, but it's holding Indiana to just 16 yards rushing. To put that into context, Michigan collected 27 yards in sacks against Indiana. The Hoosiers only rushed for 16 yards. Now, Gene, when you see those numbers, just how blown away are you? Because you really don't see anything like that these days, especially in conference play.
No, you do not. And it just showed you the problems Indiana had, even though they had a reasonable offense at times in other games, how great Michigan's defense was. And in the second half, when I went back and looked at what people were writing at the Times, people said Michigan did everything but take a knee in the second half on offense, and that the second half resembled a controlled scrimmage. Michigan used all 66 players who made the trip. And Cameron, the coach for Indiana, their first-year coach, said a number of great things about the Michigan defense, one of which was they look like that team they had in the middle 80s. That was a big compliment. And he also thanked Lloyd Carr for really not running up the score. Now, the final was 37-0. Cameron's quote was, "Some people might have tried to score 100, but he didn't. I thanked him because it could have been a lot worse than it was." And basically, they shut the offense down. The defense, despite playing everybody who was there, Indiana couldn't do anything. And Indiana, as you might imagine, didn't go with its four-string offense. They were keeping first and second string offense out there. And Michigan's got third stringers and people who never play, and they couldn't do anything.
Michigan goes on to beat Indiana 37-0, collecting their first shutout and first Big Ten victory of the season. Now, they're 4-0 in 1997. One important highlight in the game is the continued standout play from Michigan's Charles Woodson. The defensive back collected one of two Michigan interceptions on the afternoon. It was Woodson's second interception of the season, but it would take a few more weeks and a few more moments for Woodson's Heisman run to take shape. Nothing really changes in the polls either. Florida and Florida State blast their opponents. Penn State and Nebraska do the same. Things really don't change until next week. That's when things take a small but significant turn in the polls. Before we go, our guest has been Gene Myers. Anjanette Delgado and Kirkland Crawford are the executive producers of this podcast. Kerry Jr. II provides technical support. Peter Bhatia is the editor of the Detroit Free Press. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Road to the Victors on Apple, Spotify, or your preferred streaming app of choice. And find us at freep.com/podcasts. Please subscribe, leave a rating, and tell your friends about us. It really does help. For more information on the 1997 Michigan team, pre-order the book Hail Yes, the story of the 1997 Michigan Wolverines at freep.com. I'm Andrew Hammond, and we'll see you next week.